To add pre-rendering to an Angular application, you need to run that same command you ran before to add server-side rendering. @Angular SSR must be added with the ng-add command. So here in this project, I did already run that, so nothing needs to be done here. This is all already prepared. Because pre-rendering in the end is just a sub-form of server-side rendering, you could say. Especially since you might not want to pre-render all your routes. The ones that rely on data that must be as up-to-date as possible can't be pre-rendered, for example. But out of the box, when building an Angular application and enabling server-side rendering, Angular will already try to pre-render some pages. And you can see that in the Angular JSON configuration file. There, you should find a pre-render option, which is set to true out of the box. Which means Angular tries to identify pages that can be pre-rendered. And by default, it identifies pages as pre-renderable if they're not dynamic, which means if they don't have dynamic route parameters. So in this application, all those user-related pages would not be pre-rendered because they have this dynamic user ID parameter. And Angular doesn't know in advance which user IDs you have in your application. So it can't pre-render all those different pages for the different users. But it, for example, can pre-render this no-task component page. And it indeed did so. If you take a look in your dist folder after running npm run build, and there you take a look at the browser folder, you will see that in there, in the index.html file here, which is the starting page HTML file, in there you will actually see that content from that no task component. This fallback text that you should select a user to see their tasks. And that list of users that was rendered. And that is all in this file because it was pre-rendered. Now, of course, you might want to pre-render more pages. You might know in advance which user IDs exist, and you might want to pre-render the pages for those users. And it turns out that you can do that. Because what you can do is you can add a new file to your Angular project, to the root project folder, for example, and give that any file name of your choice, like user-routes.txt. But again, the file name is up to you. But it's a plain text file here because in this file, you should now specify all the routes you want Angular to pre-render with one route path per line. So for example, users/u1/tasks and users/u2/tasks and so on. So these now must be valid paths that would work in your application. And if that's the case, you can go back to the Angular JSON file and change this pre-render setting from true to an object, which allows you to configure pre-rendering in greater detail. Because here in this object, you can now add a routes file property and set this to the path to the file that contains the routes that should be pre-rendered. In my case, user-routes.txt. So this is a path seen relative from the root project folder. If you do that, and you save this, and you run npm run build again, you will see that as the build process runs here, more routes are pre-rendered. Here, Angular tells me that 3 different static routes were pre-rendered. And if we go to the dist routing folder, into the browser folder, we can now see that users folder with the U1 and U2 subfolders with the tasks subfolders and their respective index.html files, which contain the content for these specific users, like their name. So now Angular did execute the components that were required for these paths during the build process, and it pre-rendered those pages. And as mentioned, if you pre-render all your application's pages, you could just deploy this browser folder and you would have a static web app again, which consists of multiple pages that have all been pre-rendered at build time. Alternatively, you deploy both browser and server, and you therefore have a mixture of pre-rendered and dynamically rendered pages. And that's therefore this third option you have when it comes to building Angular application. Building single-page applications without server-side rendering can be great because you don't need any dynamic web server for that, but of course you have the potential disadvantage that search engine optimization can be a problem. If that is a problem for you, you could go for server-side rendering, but if you know that at least some of your pages can be pre-rendered, you might want to make sure that that's happening in your application as well, and you might use static site generation, either to have a mixture of pre-rendered and dynamically rendered pages, or to have just pre-rendered pages, and therefore a static website again. These are the options, and as mentioned, it depends on you and your application's requirements which option works best for you.